In this video, Jordan Peterson explains how to determine what someone actually believes in.
Now, people think that the world is an objective place because we can describe it objectively, and that's a much more debatable presupposition. It's partly debatable because it's actually based on a decision, in some sense, rather than evidence. Partly because your knowledge is finite in every direction, in some sense. So what that means, in a way, is that no matter what you know about anything, you don't know everything about that thing. And so you kind of ground out in ignorance at some point. And so what that means is that you have to buttress your thinking with a set of assumptions that you don't question, or you just end up in an infinite regress. And one of those sets of assumptions is usually reality definition sets of assumptions, or truth definition sets of assumptions. But the thing is, generally, no matter what your theory of reality is, or what your theory of truth is, there are alternative theories of reality and alternative theories of truth that are equally rigorous and that have different domains of application. And it's a very tricky business. So for example, if you're a reductionist materialist, you're going to make the presupposition that brain physiology is more real than emotional experience. And I suppose that's in some sense because you can't get access to anyone else's emotional experience, at least not directly, whereas you can get universal access to the fundamental details of someone's brain physiology. It's something like that anyways. Now, that's still an arbitrary assumption because obviously the person, and you as well, are going to be acting all the time as if your emotions and your motivational states are real. And so then you run into a problem, and the problem is, well, how do you know what someone actually believes? Do you listen to what they say, or do you take into account their explicit and well-articulated theories, or do you watch how they act? And the answer to that is, you make your choice, and generally there are reasons for that. Now, one of the conceptual tools that I have found helpful in my attempts to avoid confusion when dealing with the fact that there are very many ways of looking at the world is to start thinking about theories of reality as tools rather than as descriptions. And I find that extraordinarily useful as a metaphor because, if you have a toolbox full of tools, you don't necessarily try to reduce the utility of one tool to another, and you don't actually complain because all the tools aren't the same. A wrench isn't a very good hammer, but that doesn't mean you can criticize it on that grounds. You might not want to use it as a hammer, although you could, I suppose, but it's not justifiable criticism. And it looks to me, and this is something a psychologist named George Kelly pointed out as well, although I think it's also an element of pragmatic philosophy, is that one set of tools for one thing and another set of tools for another thing. And that's helpful. That's helpful. And so, and then, you're also thinking about the sorts of problems that you might solve with different forms of tools. And one problem is, what are things made of, in an objective sense, let's say. And then another problem might be, well, what is the landscape of experience? And that's more of a phenomenological problem. That's the problem the phenomenologists set out. And then the other problem might be, how do you and should you conduct yourself? And it could easily be that you can't use the same tool to solve all of those problems. And I would say that's particularly true technically when you're dealing with science, because science by its very nature refuses to answer questions about what it is that you should do, apart from some implicit assumption that you should do science, which is actually not, well, that's actually not a scientific assumption, by the way, because it's a moral assumption. And the moral assumption is that if you conduct yourself in a scientific manner, things will be better, right? Because why would you run around doing science to make things worse? Although you absolutely can. And perhaps we are, and even if we aren't, we still might. So that's one of the things that I find quite interesting about the scientific endeavor, and this is something Jung observed, was that it has to be nested in something outside of itself to give it its motive force. It has to be nested in a system of moral assumptions. And the fundamental moral assumption is, the world will be a better place if we conduct ourselves along scientific lines, because otherwise why do it? And that's a statement that cannot be analyzed from within the confines of the scientific worldview, because it doesn't analyze those sorts of questions. Now, you could say they're not real, but that's a stupid answer, because I think it's a cop-out. Maybe it's not a stupid answer. It probably is. But at least it's a cop-out, because if you don't take that question seriously, you can't really justify engaging in the activity. And so you can refuse to answer it, but you're basically answering it by engaging in the activity anyway, so even if you're not saying it, you're still justifying it. All right, so, assuming that you can draw conclusions from people's actions like you can from their statements, and it's hard really to dispute that, I would say. If you're wise, in fact, I think you derive more conclusions from their actions than from their statements. So, okay, so that's the underbelly of the first proposition, and the development of that is something like the means by which information is transmitted that is relevant to the domain of behavior is not the same means by which it's transmitted, by which scientific information is transmitted. And we kind of know that too, without any real debate, I believe, because how old do you think science is as a technical endeavor? What would you estimate? Hundreds of years. Maybe thousands of years if you're willing to give the Greeks some credit. But really probably not, probably hundreds, because Aristotle wasn't a scientist. Like, he wasn't a bad observer, but he certainly was an empirical observer, and no one got science straightened out till it's probably, Newton, Descartes, Bacon, and there's a handful of other characters who were thinking around that period of time, and they sort of, established the proper methods, really, and also the philosophy that underlies. It's not very old, 600 years, 500 years, man, that's really nothing. It's the blink of an eye. It's yesterday, if that. It might even be like an hour ago. It's nothing. But obviously people were transmitting information about how to act to each other for untold millennia before that, and it's probably more like, it depends on what you're willing to consider transmission of information. But even octopi can imitate, and so they're the smartest invertebrates. They're quite bright, those things. They're not exactly sure how smart. They only live a couple of years, so they can't really get things going, But they can problem solve. They can pull corks out of bottles to get like a crab in a bottle. And then if they watch an octopus, if an octopus watches another octopus pull a cork out of a bottle to get a tasty crab, then that octopus now knows how to do it. So, which is pretty impressive. And you can kind of see why octopi might be able to do that, because not only do they have a brain, but they have little tentacly appendages which allow them to manipulate things, right? And so one of the precursors to being able to be intelligent in any active way is that you have to have tentacly appendages so that you can manipulate the world, right? And at least for it to be anything resembling what we would consider intelligence, and that's part of the reason that dolphins really aren't as intelligent as people like to think, because what are they going to do? They can't build cities with their flippers, They're kind of trapped in their test tube bodies, and the same thing applies to whales. So obviously they have very large brains, and they're very social, and they can learn, but whatever their intelligence is, it's not like our intelligence, because we run around tearing things apart, putting them back together, and we've got the body for that. So